Thank you, and good morning, everyone, for being here. I know I got a lot of pushback yesterday about Sunday morning, 10 o'clock. But as you know from yesterday, we really have a packed program, and we just want to make sure that we can do justice to our sessions, and we can wind up as planned. Day 2, our first panel is going to be art and ecology. This will run from 10 to 11:30 a.m. We will have a tea break from 11:30 a.m. to 12. Panel 2, performance, bodies and grief. That's from 12 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. We have a lunch break from 1:30 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. Please use that 1 hour to also meet with the curators among yourselves, have those discussions on the sidelines of the symposium. Panel 3, collective curating, who is the institution, that will run from 2:30 to 4, and then I'll just make my closing remarks. For our first panel, Art and Ecology, we have Damian Christinger as our moderator, and our panelists are Arushi, Vats, Nancy Adajania, and Ravi Agarwal. In case you're wondering why that one seat is vacant, unfortunately, due to the fire at Heathrow, Arushi's flight from London had to be rescheduled, so she's unfortunately not going to be able to make this symposium. But she's very sweetly sent us her AV presentation, which we are going to be playing. Let me just quickly get on to short bios, and then I'm going to hand over the floor to Damian. Damian Christinger works as an independent curator, writer, and lecturer at different institutions on transcultural theory and practice in curating the Anthropocene and indigenous knowledge. He worked as a guest curator for the Museum Rietberg Zurich in 2014-2015 and was the co-curator of the Assemblea Mother Tree in collaboration with Ernesto Neto, Fondation Baylor, and Daniela Simon. Arushi Vats is a doctoral researcher pursuing a PhD in the history of art at the University of Cambridge and an associate lecturer at the Cambridge School of Art, Anglia, Ruskin University. She received the Momus E-Beam Critical Writing Fellowship and the Art Scribes Award. Nancy Adajania is a cultural theorist and curator based in Bombay. She was joint artistic director of the 9th Gwangju Biennale, South Korea. She's curated several path-breaking exhibitions, including most recently 100 Years and Counting, Rescripting K.G. Subramanian, and Woman is as Woman Does, a first ever intergenerational mapping of the works of Indian women artists, filmmakers, and activists against the backdrop of the women's movement in India. And finally, Ravi Agarwal is an interdisciplinary artist, photographer, environmental campaigner, writer, and curator whose work bridges art and activism. His practice addresses the complex relationship between the nature and its future through photography, video, text, and installation. Ravi's work has been exhibited at major biennales, and he has curated large public art projects like the Yamuna Elba and Embrace Our Rivers, and served as photography curator for the Serendipity Arts Festival, and was the curatorial advisor for the exhibition Carbon at the Science Gallery in Bengaluru. And with that, I'll hand over to Damian to take the session forward.
Good morning. Are we awake yet? Yes? Thank you for having me. Curating at the intersection of art and ecology requires an acute awareness, both of nature's intrinsic agency and of our role as cultural mediators. It requires what we call consciousness, or sensing, sense-making. Consciousness in curating is more than an intellectual exercise. It is a practice of attunement, a deliberate way of engaging with both the artworks and the ecological contexts in which they emerge. It demands a sensibility that blends environmental awareness with artistic discourse, creating spaces where art does not merely represent nature, but actively participates in its rhythms, urgencies, and transformations. A conscious approach to curating ecology in the arts begins with acknowledging nature not as a backdrop to human activity, but as an active presence with its own narratives, materialities, and modes of existence, its own modes of consciousness. The natural world is not simply a theme to be explored, but a collaborator in the curatorial process. This entails a shift from an anthropocentric worldview to an encompassing ecological one, where art and nature exist in mutual entanglement. It means recognizing that to curate is to care, as we heard yesterday, not just for artists, artworks, and audiences, but for the natural world that sustains all of these forms of life. In this way, ecological consciousness in curating becomes a practice of responsibility, imagination, and deep listening, as we will hear, ironically, listening to from Arushi Vats. The art of conceiving the world poetically is a skill. It evades logic and yet also accompanies it. Work created from this spirit honors natural forces as well as the local and canon of global ideas. Art appears as imagination, as a possible way of creating a shared planet. Artistic knowledge created from this understanding is a space of gathering and reunion, a traditional form of learning and engagement as practiced for millennia. Contemporary art can function in this way like a prism that focuses our ignorance, our lostness in the face of planetary questions, our inability to overcome the artificial dichotomy between nature and humanity. And I think Nancy Adajania will address this. Invoking new perspectives on what life and art, ecology and science could look like, perhaps it is necessary to question the future to come rooted in the mud, living in the trees, frozen in the melting glaciers, and in the DNA of extinct species and future ones. But also in the poetry and visions of common ancestors, the vegetal and the mineral. As climate change brings more extreme weather, we are all aware, heat and monsoon disruptions, flooding, drought, sea level rise, and rapid glacial melting, it plays an ever greater role in shaping geopolitics. This is what we're experiencing right now, right? What seems to be political conflicts about contested identities and national belongings, about trade and greatness, race and being ourselves, more often than not have at their root controversies about control over resources, of course. Climate refugees will become a new designation for people displaced very soon by climate-induced degradations and shortages. While the migration for economic reasons, as old as humanity itself, is being scapegoated everywhere, instead of being rationally addressed, alternative models of life like ours are under attack in our democracies, where the growing influence of megacorporations and a new wave of nationalisms and economic protectionism form an unholy alliance in a digital age. And it is not that we lack the data to analyze these problems, but it seems that we are unable to read it as a whole. Our societies have become analphabets, incapable of reading between the lines, of looking behind the picture. It is no coincidence that the intellectuals are becoming targets all over the world again, as they are the ones who are able to intelligere, which can be variously translated from Latin as understand, feel, see or look into, recognize, decode, fathom, review, appreciate, apprehend, realize, know, can something, and so on. Our problem is not that lack of data, it is dissemination of knowledge, understanding the differences between information and knowledge. The problem is a form of global illiteracy facing the Anthropocene. We lack hermeneutics. And I think Ravi Agarwal will address this. It helps on mornings like these to pick up an old book, I believe, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, published in 1968 and in English in 1970, and reread it while we sip our coffee or tea. In it, Paulo Freire, who died in 1997, develops the concept of conscientization, conscientização, which could also be called critical consciousness or consciousness raising. In a time of political crisis like ours, critical consciousness, according to Freire, focuses on achieving a global, transcultural understanding of the world, allowing for the perception and exposure of social and political contradictions. If we read the contemporary desire amongst a diverse group of artists and curators to renegotiate the legacy of the critical modern and reimagine alternative possible outcomes within the framework developed by Paulo Freire, this desire does not seem to be driven by nostalgia, but an authentic attempt to re-engage in the multiple potentials that a critical modernism offered. As information is now instantaneously available, both past and present become simultaneously influential, regardless of boundaries, international or otherwise. Ideas, partly disconnected from their original meaning and context, and no longer dependent or connected to the original intention, can become a catalyst for constructive reinterpretation. This becomes like a visual or conceptual echo chamber where ideas and beliefs, resonating from the original source, reverberate out through life and time and space. Freire's ideas continue to be a contemporaneous call for action when he writes, and I quote, "The more radical the person is, the more fully he or she enters into reality so that, knowing it better, he or she can transform it. This individual is not afraid to confront, to listen, to see the world unveiled. This person is not afraid to meet the people or to enter into a dialogue with them. This person does not consider himself or herself the proprietor of history or of all people or the liberator of the oppressed, but he or she does commit himself or herself within history to fight at their side." Hermeneutic thinkers like the Canadian philosopher Charles Margrave Taylor argue that modernity created a cultural consciousness that has been shaped in such a way that we imagine ourselves as islands of awareness, floating in the great ocean of life, being mere visitors on this spaceship called Earth. This spacious self-consciousness can be understood as a disengaged self, the contrary to what Freire is calling for above, and contrary to the woven fabric of time and tradition. How do we transform ourselves and those around us through exhibition making from these islands of awareness into those unafraid not only to see the world unveiled, but ready to fight alongside the oppressed, which today doesn't only mean the millions of humans who are marginalized within the capital scene, of course, but for example, other species like plants or oceans of what we could call the Cthulhu Sea. A political theorist like Bernard Craig, who always maintained that, I quote, "politics is ethics done in public," end of quote, a claim that almost sounds sarcastic nowadays, reads Freire's theory as a call to intellectual and artistic arms. Critical consciousness includes taking action against oppressive elements in the global sphere, actions that are illuminated by a political and poetic understanding. This might mean to inscribe pedagogy into the act of creating art and culture, of writing a new narrative, and defining what these terms actually mean. The purpose of a poetological and conscious approach within the arts and curating towards true contemporaneity is neither simply to share Western and non-Western's own particular and situated constructions of knowledge, but rather to co-create multiple knowledges, thus expanding each individual's own perspective beyond the situated bounds of each of our respective singular contexts and traditions. Taking into account the pedagogy of the oppressed that Freire developed, this means to implement methods and methodologies that allow these contexts and traditions to see eye to eye. To be fruitful, the exchanges need to be reciprocal to evoke our shared memories of the ethos of community. So this is to frame the contributions we will hear, and I'm very happy that Nancy will start. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Meera, Mamta, Soherpem, for organizing this wonderful symposium. And it's lovely to be back for the second edition. So my presentation today, it will begin with a philosophical meditation on the landscape that I encountered a few weeks ago in the Himalayan foothills. It will then segue into a brief memoir of my curatorial and discursive practice, especially the part that relates to the challenges of making art and showing art in the era of the Anthropocene. I hope you will indulge me as I shift register and tonality. Feeling a bit uncomfortable. Thank you. Sorry, takleef there. Thank you. the color of the wind from a place of knowing and not knowing. A cloud is a sail shimmering in dying light. A charred rhododendron, black blood in which history writes itself. A branch is a forked tongue that speaks in two languages that I strain to grasp. I am told that deep in the forest, where a leopard gave chase to a deer, the deer's leg still dangles from the gnarled branch of a tree. Am I looking at the landscape, or is the landscape looking at me? Am I dreaming the forest, or is the forest dreaming me? I find myself asking the question that the Buddhist monk Nagasena once posed to the Indo-Greek king Milinda or Menander. What is the color of the wind? What is its shape? Is it thin or thick, long or short? I want to dwell in the place of not knowing for as long as possible. The monk would go on to convince the king that just as the wind can be felt but not seen, nirvana too is real even if it can't be seen. Both the wind and nirvana are known through their effects. The nirvana whirlwind can break you and remake you. It can feel like a fist of cold puncturing your ailing heart. It can feel like the shedding of leaves in the wrong season, a shedding, a replenishing. But I say to the monk, I'm neither a king nor a maggot craving nirvana. I am a humble scribe and maker of exhibitions who wants to trace the shape of thought, its rough and smooth edges, its underbelly of unknowing, its quicksilver unpredictability, its distilled, shimmering, shattering light. Dekho, suno, nazar manzar, nazarya, nom tom jalatrut, vilambit lay, khula, khali. See, hear, sight, landscape, ways of seeing, mystery syllables in melody, fast, faster, slow, very slow, open, empty, emptiness. For me, it is both an intuitive and a philosophically informed process to interpret artistic thought and translate curatorial concepts into an exhibition. Exhibition making is an act of making visible, oral, and olfactory all that is suppressed by force of habit or custom or oppressed by ossified prejudice. Exhibition making is akin to pricking infinitesimal holes in the minds of viewers and readers to let the light in. On a starry night, the wind carries the smell of charred pine needles and settles on my tongue as I balance myself on the edge of a Himalayan cliff. The cheer pine is an invasive species that has threatened to overrun the region's hardy banj oak. The cheer pine needles which carpet the forest floor are highly combustible. The pine resin, which swells Uttarakhand's state treasury, is also highly inflammable. As the aquifers are drained, with drier and drier spells worsened by climate change, and with droughts and unquenchable forest fires, we are now living in an endangered landscape. The leopard, I'm told, came face to face with a woman foraging in the forest. From the spot where I stood, the villager had heard the leopard growl, but his voice could never have pierced to the innards of a dense forest to warn a woman carrying an intolerably large bundle of leaves and grass. Why blame the leopard when human beings are capable of visiting unbearable suffering on their own kind? Have you ever walked for kilometers on end with a headload of 40 to 50 kilos of fodder, or fallen off trees innumerable times while cutting branches and gathering leaves? I make exhibitions to find where the stress falls, to hear the bone crack, to hear the tree fall in slow motion, to hear trauma splinter. I will forever carry the woman with the intolerably heavy head load on my shoulders. I know empathy is not the same as being overly sensitive, but we have forgotten to feel intensely. In the art world, the word empathy remains a static noun. It rarely becomes an active, living verb. In an anthology that I edited for the Raza Foundation, Some Things That Only Art Can Do, a lexicon of affective knowledge in 2017, I addressed the issue of art being increasingly instrumentalized and made to serve various political and social agendas. We fail to understand that there are many things that art can do, but there are some things that only art can do. Many of us tend to flatten art out and reduce it to a commentary on its context. Art is often not allowed to realize its expressive potential. The discursive is foregrounded at the expense of the expressive and the experiential. My editorial manifesto proposed the building of a new lexicon of affective knowledge. By affect, I don't mean a simple binaristic opposition to cognitive or discursive experience. In fact, I see affect as a critical ground for political action. For this transdisciplinary anthology, the artist Ravi Agarwal contributed the keyword ecogenic to counter the human nature binary implicit in the notion of the anthropogenic. This approach foregrounds the intrinsic value of nature rather than emphasize its transactional value, which treats nature as natural capital in a neoliberal economy. For Ravi, a community's memories related to their land and land use and the complex intertwined economic and cultural ideas of nature embedded in local knowledge are key to crafting an ecogenic idea for a sustainable future. While conducting research for his exhibition, Else All Will Be Still, Ravi realized that he would have to shed his romantic ideas of the sea and become, and I quote him, a student and a seeker. From knowing, it became an exploration, he says. I can relate to Ravi's need to move away from predetermined ideas and experientially immerse himself in the life of the sea and the fisherfolk. Here, he pickets the sea with words borrowed from the everyday life of the fishing community. Their flags of everyday survival, the roar of the rusted boat engine, the open maw of the trawler, the sangam or confluence of knowing and not knowing what lies beneath the seemingly calm waters. Another contributor to Some Things That Only Art Can Do was Rajkumar Koram, the Buster-based artist of Adivasi heritage. He contributed the word akal. Akal bears many shades of meaning, ranging from intelligence and worldly knowledge to self-preserving shrewdness. Its emancipatory register stands in exact opposition to how an Adivasi person is normally perceived as being backward and untouched by civilization. This word emerges from a conversation I had with Rajkumar about his self-portrait carved into one of his wooden sculptures. In this sculpture, Akal manifested itself as fat raindrops, boond collected in the artist's head, which was shaped like a pitcher with holes in it. These Akal drops or Akal boons were collected from gurus of all kinds, both human and more than human. Tracing the water streaming down in his self-portrait, Rajkumar told me, and I quote, "You can't predict when, where, or how, drop by drop, we accumulate intelligence. That experience, that water collected over the years, somewhere or the other, we open our hearts and share it with others. That's why I believe that Akal is like the flowing water of a river. It does not remain the private property of any single person. It keeps sharing its gifts with everyone as it goes." Close quote. Rajkumar's precise use of Akal signals to all those who want their Adivasis to remain a noble savage that this Adivasi will not be interpolated by those who wish to fix him in a primitivist or a primordial identity. Akal cuts through years of interpolation, but also importantly privileges the Adivasi ethic of sharing and exchange. The shape of thought, or what happens at its edges before it stabilizes into the knowable, has been a long-term preoccupation of mine. I was happy to find another kindred soul invested in the act of visualizing Akal, which carries the shimmer of both nous and technique. The knowledge commons that Rajkumar imagines is a work in progress. He, as well as millions of India's Adivasis, can no longer rely on the organic and embedded presence of ancestral knowledge systems which have been ruptured brutally over several centuries by the extractivist practices imposed on their traditional lands, the structures of oppression and the policies of displacement that have alienated them from their hereditary terrains and resources. Thus, we cannot and should not romanticize traditional epistemologies. Instead, we must attend to the ways in which Adivasi artists have sought to reclaim elements of their inherited forms of coexistence with the natural world, even as they've had to contend with aggressive deforestation, the poisoning of their rivers and water tables, the denigration of their languages. In this process, they've had to imagine their life world afresh and recalibrate their role in a present whose dominant forces seek to exclude and marginalize them. I will now move on to Woman is as Woman Does, which I curated at the CSMVS JNAF in 2022, which foregrounded an intersectional feminist politics. Artists born to privilege were shown alongside those of Dalit or Adivasi origin. Artists who mainly concentrate on studio practice appeared alongside artists who produced zines and graphic novels, or those who had collaborated with subaltern artists, local communities, farmers, and activists. Here I showed the work of the Gram Art Collective, which was initiated around 2015 by the artist Shweta Bhattad in collaboration with artists, homemakers, farmers, and social workers in Paratsinga village on the border of Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra. It is amazing to map Shweta's journey from an art student at MS University Baroda to her solo performances on gender disparity and food wastage. And that journey actually takes you from both words and performative actions, which were high on rhetoric, to a completely different way of being and acts of making. So she moved away from her academic pedagogy and also bypassed the art world paradox of politicizing the aesthetic and aestheticizing the political by purging herself of cliches. I draw the metaphor of purging from one of her early performance works on Food Vomit, which critiqued wasteful consumption in the face of agrarian precarity. In a psychosomatic sense, I would say that Shweta purged herself of the toxins of both rhetoric and consumerism to live an artful life rather than to make art. Overcoming the distinction between art, non-art, human, non-human, skin, soil, breath, wind, Shweta and the women of Paratsinga have moved from an alienated life to one of replenishment of the senses, of the soil, of the body. In Woman is as Woman Does, I showed a selection of images and stories culled from Shweta's Insta and FB pages that acknowledge the contributions of seed savers and provide information about traditional farm implements and forgotten varieties of seeds and grains and vegetables. At the Gram Art Collective, they have worked on land art projects. They also make yarn artifacts from desi kapas or non-GM indigenous cotton that they grow and dye themselves. They have created eco-friendly rakhis, and plantable firecrackers, as well as edible artifacts made from the organic produce grown on Shweta's farm. Here's the Dilwale Beej, an organic heart shape found on the seeds of the balloon vine. In Woman is as Woman Does, in order to create dialogical adjacencies, I invited the artist Durgabai Vyam, an artist of Pardhan Gond heritage, to show her illustrations for the biography of Dr. Ambedkar. At a children's workshop accompanying the exhibition, I did not want the students of the workshop to be merely acquainted with Durgabai's particular style of painting. Instead, I wanted them to get a glimpse into her life world through storytelling, song, and utterance. Thus, I requested Durgabai to narrate a story of her choice. She came up with the story of the tiger and the boar, Sher or Suwar ki Kahani. A tiger and a boar were living in amity in the jungle. एक दिन सुअर के बच्चे हुए और बच्चे के भी बच्चे हो गए. शेर के बच्चे और सुअर के बच्चे खेलत रहे हैं. The tiger cubs and the piglets played together. When the tiger and the boar would go for lunch, the cubs and the piglets began to fight. The cubs threatened the piglets. We'll eat you up. The piglets complained to the boar. They'll throw us out of the jungle. The boar pacified the piglets and told them that everything will be okay. But the fighting resumed. The boar says, I'll take the kids and leave. If we keep fighting like this, it will be the end of our friendship with the tiger. At that point, Durgabai breaks into a song. Sherni kehti hai, apan dost hai, kahan jabo? The boar laments, we will always remain friends. The boar leaves the forest to live in a village, and the tiger continues to live in the forest. This parable about the ideal of harmonious coexistence demonstrates an awareness of the forces ranged against it. This scenario demarcates the wild from the domesticated, habitation from expulsion. It carries the Adivasis' anguished knowledge of their gradual alienation from their own environment. When Durgabai sings, Sherni kehti hai, apan dost hai, kahan jabo? This kahan jabo here is not just an expression of the tigress's empathy for the boar. We are friends, where will you go? What Durgabai is actually saying is what is the future that awaits us? It's a cry from the heart. Where are we heading? Thank you.
We'll continue straight to Arushi's contribution, which, as you heard, unfortunately, will just be for us to listen to and see here on the screen.
There is an abundance of information on what we may broadly situate as ecology, even though the definitional parameters of this word would likely be different based on our positionalities and situatedness. Much of this information is coded and assembled into various formations and intensities, among which the documentary form is encountered frequently, whether through news time and dispersed media networks, or through artistic interventions in the documentary mode. Against the documentary impulse to seek truth effects and reality effects, a conceptual framework that can serve as a compass in navigating aspects of ecological being and vanishing that I would like to explore today is proposed by Pooja Rangan and defined as counter-forensic listening or attention to inaudibilities in confronting the material conditions of testimony and the hyphenated sensing of the listener. Where Al Weisman's proposition of performing forensis includes creating a public architecture of truth, Rangan repositions the idea to include counter-forensic tactics of listening to that which is rendered inaudible in the regimes of meaning such as law and sociality, deferring the possibilities through which truth is settled upon. Rangan magnifies our attention to clicks, static, errata, glitches, scratches, stops, the traces of media and mediated surrounding and human sounds through the application of engaged objectivity that acknowledges the embodied specificities of the listener as constitutive of the materiality of listening. This attention to the inaudible is not done with the intent to bring it into the fold of meaning or to make disjunctures make sense, but to confront, and I quote here, the vestiges of objectivity that inhere in conventional acquisitive modes of documentary listening. Close quotes. In considering art making as zones of appearance and its afterlife as documents, I'm keen to think of counterforensis and inaudibility as creating the conditions of opaque presencing. Such research draws from Saidiya Hartman's work on critical fabulation, written in the midst of navigating the partial, erased, and silenced archive of the Middle Passage, and which asks us to reach into the locus of impossible speech and employ speculative techniques such as performative narration, experimental reenactment, animation, essayistic digression, etc. To that end, I am proposing to think of these strategies as they're employed by artist duo Halozoic Desires in their ongoing installation and intermedia projects at Tate Britain and Somerset House, titled Salt Cosmologies, focusing in particular on The Hedge of Halomancy, a film projected from the ceiling onto a salt pan and accompanied by various and numerous installation elements. Halozoic Desires, a duo comprising of poet, performance, and visual artist Himali Singh Soin and musician-composer David Soin Tapisser, practice a politics of recapturing the senses, using sound, body, and the landscape to explore the potential of archives. This approach frames their inquiry into the salt regulations introduced by the East India Company in the 18th century, an economic policy that had far-reaching consequences on ecology, habitation, and community life in colonial India through 19th and 20th century. The history of salt and empire has often focused solely on the Salt March led by M.K. Gandhi in 1930, and I recall here Jaspir Puar's warning to us against using a flashpoint mode of history, shedding too much light on one part of history to obscure others. Yet few historians have noted that the story of the colonial tax on salt arcs back to 1756, when this naturally forming mineral came into the imperial fold through a strenuous taxation policy that sought to obstruct the flow of salt from regions abundant in vast natural salt pans such as Sambar in present-day Rajasthan to lands under the purview of East India Company, notably the Bengal Presidency. In 1803, the East India Company established the Inland Customs Line by transforming the checkpost installed across the trade routes of Bengal into an infrastructure intended to monitor and restrict the circulation of salt among indigenous and other colonized communities. Imposing a heavy duty, this taxation regime effectively criminalized regional practices of exchange, rendering salt, which was accessible as commons, into a curtailed commodity. However, these checkposts were found to be insufficient and susceptible to breaches by local tradesmen. As the company's ambitions grew, the customs line expanded and evolved, transforming into a continuous living barrier made of bushes, thorns, walls, ditches, and checkposts, spanning 2,300 miles and manned by over 12,000 guards and gardeners. With no visual sources available in the imperial records of the hedge, this instrument of cartographic dominance and economic control now survives as a tangible, yet absent entity, a spectre that haunts administrative and legal notations about its scale, upkeep, and efficacy. In The Hedge of Halomancy, the film installation at the center of their new display at Tate Britain, Halozoic Desires rescue the customs line from archival absence. By tuning into the echoes of fugitives, a diviner and courtesan, an imperial occultist politician, countless local traders, and the vivid networks of non-human life that wove themselves into the orbit of the hedge, Halozoic Desires uncover this forgotten chapter of colonization to alert us to the perhaps one of many origins of our contemporary crises. The hedge of halomancy is projected downwards towards the floor, with the screen's edges encrusted in salt, recalling the pearlescent zones of salt and sambar where it was filmed. Part speculation, part parable, in the hedge of halomancy we meet the many protagonists of this unwieldy tale, as they're conjured by halozoic desires from scant references, marginalia, statistics, imperial correspondences, and novels of the period. Performing as Mayali, a courtesan, mentioned briefly in imperial accounting books for refusing to forego her stipend of salt from imperial authorities, Sing Soin awakens us to salt's plurality. For Mayali, an oracle and diviner, salt is magical, imbued with the power to access spiritual domains. It cannot be replaced by currency. For the flamingos that punctuate Sambar and its sky, salt is epidermal, a pink hue drawn from the salt lakes they inhabit. For countless unnamed persons in imperial records, tax salt is evidentiary, catalyzed as a penal regime. For others, tax salt was death. The company provided no concession on the price of salt even as epidemics of diarrhea and cholera raged, placing even a gulp of saline solution beyond the means of many. When Mayali first appears to us in the film, we see only her limbs through the decorative lancets on a wall, signaling resistance in a raised fist, while her feet move to the rhythms of a march. As Mayali moves through the salt pans, her gestures are fluid and aerial, drawing connections with the earth and heavens. Sing Soin describes this movement as both ambivalent and opaque, which conveys the artist's approach to reframing history. This duality of time and its rupture persists throughout the film. Mayali's movements unfold in the presence of Sambar's inhabitants, the birds that circle the sky and the fish who wash up drowning in salt, a slow ecocide that is reminiscent of the many in our present times. Her kinship with more than human life is not accidental. She engages in an imagined spiritual communication with Alan Octavian Hume, an imperial civil servant, ornithologist, spiritualist, and a chronicler of the hedge who would go on to establish, among others, the Indian National Congress. Hume's trajectory from an agent of the empire to anti-colonial politics, tinged heavily by Orientalist fantasies and perspectives, and guided by an interest in birds and the occult, is imagined as intersecting with Mayali's divination, a contact that could transform both of them. We see Mayali whispering in the ruins of a colonial prison, her breath able to surpass all notions of a barrier. Her incantations and journeys are interspersed with footage captured by a hovering drone that seems to patrol even the absence of the hedge. The permanently watchful eye of power tracks the world unceasingly. A blue tinge seeps into the frames. Blue is the color of salt as it evaporates. Cholera shrouds the skin with blue. Blue, too, must be the bruises borne by those who waded this thicket to liberate salt from the tyranny of empire. Halozoic desires also fill in the visual gaps in the archive, utilizing artificial intelligence tools to generate images of the hedge and its interlocutors. In these imagined pictures, the hedge appears as fecund, overgrown, and defiant. Each such act of speculation undoes the erasure of the colonial archive. The silent, numb archive of the salt tax is here rendered replete with hauntings and possibilities, even as we must contend with the implications of AI technologies in contemporary ecological and surveillance crises. Such extraction or extractive technology is coupled with a form of recovery here, as Halozoic desires further revise these generative images by remaking them into salt prints, a style of photographic transfer that was subsequently replaced by albumin and is recovered here by the artists. Through forays into archival notes, we learn that the hedge was eradicated by many forces. It was eaten gradually by termites and rats, shaken by typhoons and destroyed by fire in the uprising of 1857. Towards the end of the film, we see Mayali wearing a Victorian dress made with the recycled plastic waste from the salt marshes of the Run of Kutch, which is also on display at Tate Britain alongside the film. In this sequence, she covers her body with Victorian notions of modesty and walks through a salt pan landscape along a railway track, another symbol of imperial cartography. Her entanglement with these symbols constructs a frame replete with narrative multiplicity. Is Mayali claiming this dividing line, or is this act, as hylozoic desires suggest, unclear and unresolved? Through the film, the artists cite various documentary visual tools as image fragments placed or superimposed or made to dissolve into the scene, such as maps, tables, frontispieces of colonial records. However, these do not gain narrative authority. They are not the only sources of recovering this vast and uncertain terrain. The work of critical fabulation is to not provide narrative closure, but to ask, is it possible to sense histories differently, and crucially, to sense them plurally? I end the presentation with details of cloth screens that have been erected across the lawns of Somerset House to recall the outlay of the hedge. These screens, bearing the stamps of salt monopoly, are draped such that they move with the wind, distribute light and shade, and invite touch, passage, or acts of crossing over. As the screen move with the elements and in turn behoove us to move, it is possible to think of many other histories of salt that are yet to be told. Thank you.
And straight to Ravi Agarwal, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mamta. Thank you, Mira, and the Anant team, and for the fantastic two presentations earlier. I'm going to show some images, but also speak to the ideas which inform my work and the occasional curating which I'm invited to do. There have been a few now. Some people did ask me about if I'm going to speak about the Bergen Assembly 25, and I cannot right now. It's still in process, and so I'm not going to speak about that. But the way I have thought about speaking was to lay out some ideas which, through which I work in the idea of ecology. And as you know, I inhabit multiple spheres between art and non-art, what you call non-art. I'm struggled with those definitions, but also this great idea of what art can do is very close to the reason I get so involved in it. And so in this idea of art and ecology, my curatorial instincts and my artistic instincts have been to look at grounded practices and embodied positions. It is to create a conversation between such positions to reflect the complexity of the questions, which are constantly being drowned in a dominant discourse. As a curator, I invite, but then I would like to trust and honor the artist to allow for the work to unfold as she would like it to. So the artist to me is as important, the practice is as important as the artwork. Who is that artist who's performing that? So here are some thoughts which are through which I guide my practice. And these images don't necessarily, I'm going to speak to them, but they'll be sort of part of what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is probably the focus, what you should be focusing on. The ecological condition is framed within the post-Enlightenment context, often viewed as ahistorical and approached through a positivist lens focused on future trajectories. This discourse conveys a universal nature, increasingly perceived as being in crisis, reflecting a classical scientific perspective. It underscores the urgent need to identify tipping points and pursue sustainable development. This materialist approach seeks to correct perceived ecological missteps, aiming for equilibrium. Within this framework, science serves as a universal epistemic system, shaping environmental policy institutions and influencing discourse through dominant knowledge systems. A critical framing interrogates the very concept of nature as the other, positioning the nature-culture dichotomy within a colonial context perpetuated by capitalist power. This perspective explores social and cultural heterogeneities, equity, and inquiries into more than human agencies. Concurrently, some emerging scientific discourse challenge traditional views of human superiority, sentience, and intelligence. This shift paves the way for alternate interpretations of nature as an environmental unconsciousness and emphasizes an ecology of an unalienated self. Acknowledging the interconnectedness of these concepts with identity, power dynamics, and ethical stances is vital. In my practice as an environmentalist, artist, and curator, I have operated separately, unfortunately, in both spheres. Curators, artists, and artworks can transcend mere representation, embracing a responsibility that fosters critical productivity, regeneration, and innovative speculation. In my long work with the fishing community of the coast of Bay of Bengal, a constant question which I thought of was, is the sea I see the sea they see? And Nancy, thank you for referring to some of that work. How could they read the sea as a living person, heaving and churning with life, with personhood and agency, while all I could do was to abstract it as sublime nature or a cosmic truth, distant and dreamy? Dynamic nature is a cauldron, a stew in which beings emerge, vanish, and re-emerge. There is so much we do not know and much that eludes our human understanding. We must embrace uncertainty and cultivate a more hesitant approach to our knowledge of the world. For example, instead of merely identifying a tree, we can ask, what is the relationship to this being we call a tree? Through this lens, it becomes more than a species. It transforms into a vessel of myth and spirit, a fulcrum of the invisible yet palpable world, an environmental unconsciousness. It is no longer an object, but rather an extension of a sense of self. Nature can be produced through such a relationship, and I emphasize the word produced. It is also an imprint of human oppressions onto identities. To quote a well-known poem by a Dalit writer, Om Prakash Valmiki, and I'll just read a very small portion of it. It's in Hindi called Thakur Ka Kuan, or the Thakur's Well, explores themes of caste discrimination, social justice, and human dignity. This poem reflects on the experience of a marginalized community and the relationship with the well, water, owned by the upper caste Thakur. Let's read a small bit of it. खेत ठाकुर का, बैल ठाकुर का, हल ठाकुर का, हल की मूठ पर हथेली अपनी, फसल ठाकुर की, कुआं ठाकुर का, पानी ठाकुर का, खेत खलियान ठाकुर के, गली मोहल्ले ठाकुर के, फिर अपना क्या, गांव शहर देश. As a translation I found on an Outlook magazine by Rakhi Bose. The well belongs to Thakur, the water belongs to Thakur, the crops in the field belong to Thakur, the lanes that run through neighborhoods belong to Thakur. Then what is ours? The village, the city, the nation. Mukul Sharma, a scholar, has written extensively on the relationship of caste and nature, rather unexplored area still, though artistic practices now are emerging all over India where we can locate some of these questions. There are also close similarities in modes of oppression and ideas of purity and pristineness in nature. The environmental justice movement in the US, based on waste and toxic technology, sightings in the US, have parallels in caste. In fact, the Black Panther movement helped fashion the Dalit Panther movement in India. To quote from an article, Environmental Racist History by Jediah Purdy, in 1987, the United Church of Christ's Commission for Racial Justice published an influential report that found that hazardous waste facilities were disproportionately located in minority communities and called this unequal vulnerability a form of racism. This was published in the New Yorker some years back. Again, there's a romantic idea that of we are nature, often put forward as a kind of unifying ethic of nature separation. But this can also be fractured. I quote from a piece I wrote called On Landfills and Materials on The piece is called Non-Places of the Anthropocene. The biopolitics, quote, the biopolitics of contamination invades human and more than human bodies. Toxins become burdens on the body and impact different bodies differently. Now their bodies have become additionally infiltrated with nanoparticles and microplastics containing chemicals. Till recently, scores of vultures soared over landfills, but today they are gone almost extinct. The bodies of these ancient disposers of organic waste were designed to digest flesh and bones, but not industrial toxins, which have also infused the carcasses of livestock. The body itself has become a landfill of toxic chemicals, unquote. Another area which is foundational to the idea of ecology is the way we have framed it and the way nature has been classified. The dominant imprint of humans not only defines social oppressions, but extends to the plant world. In The Botany of Empire, a recent book by Banu Subramaniam, a biologist by training and a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, writes, I quote, she writes about how the language used in scientific disciplines to plants not only reinforces societal norms, but also sexualizes nature, suggesting the need for a more nuanced and equitable approach to understanding both the natural and social worlds. I quote, Grew thus ascribed maleness to the plant because the stamen looked and functioned as a penis did in animals, declaring that every plant is male or female. Linnaeus considered stamens and pistils to be the very essence of the flower, bringing traditional notions of gender hierarchies, whole cloth into science, and incorporating fundamental aspects of human social order onto the natural worlds. While Banu Subramaniam critiques the quest for Western science as one seeking a singular, universal, and unified truth, when nature is perceived as a homogeneous entity, we must seek to transcend this techno-scientific deterministic perspective. In fact, to go beyond nature, how do we make sense of it or become conscious of it? How does the more than human world become sentient? One can recall a seminal essay written in 1974 by the philosopher Thomas Nagel, What It Is to Be Like a Bat. Another essay penned by me and my co-author, Dr. Polina Lopez, who's a glaciologist, we write, I quote, even as the sciences struggle to define consciousness empirically, various indigenous systems have for long understood the codependent relationship humans have with the world outside them. These traditions are replete with stories and rituals which honor the more than human world equally as they do human beings. Their stories encompass the world of spirits as well. They encompass cosmologies where human beings are not central, but only part of larger interconnected temporal, spatial, and spiritual dimensions. Indigenous cultures seem to not waste time in such pursuits. Rather, they engage with finding ways to harness, coexist, and honor with these other worlds. And this is an important thing for which I like to say that it's not only about finding out what those connections are, but accepting those connections and moving ahead. The questions of futures is very important in the ecological question, and how do you move ahead? And lot of the works I see nowadays. Ecology is the flavor of the month. There are more shows on ecology in the last 5 years than I've seen ever in my life, which is a good thing. But the question is, what kind of conversations are they creating? Are they just continuing the otherness of other knowledge systems? Or they're trying to create a kind of conversation, a kind of acknowledgement, which goes beyond just showing and telling. And I think that requires a little different approach than just showing artworks in one place. Many of these under other indigenous systems, for example, there's lots of work which you see now. But I always say that why you don't have to turn to the Amazon to look at knowledge systems. You have to look at living cultures here in South Asia, where these knowledge systems are not dispersed, they're not othered, they are struggling with with contestations right now. And my work with Sangam poetry, which is existing right now in Tamil Fishermen, shows those sort of kind of contestations. And I think when we look inwards into that, we don't have to just bring out other ways as something which is so distant and so unapproachable, but look at living systems now. In a similar vein, Amitav Ghosh in his Jungle Nama writes, I quote, "The Born Bibi legend uses the power of fiction to create and define a relationship between human beings and the natural world. Nowhere does a term equivalent to nature figure in the legend of Born Bibi. The word nature is not translated, the word prakriti in Sanskrit is not direct translation of nature. It has many other meanings. It also has a meaning of internal nature in a sense. So nowhere does the term equivalent to nature figure in the legend of Born Bibi, yet nowhere is its consciousness absent. Although ecological concerns are never named, the story is profoundly informed by that awareness of the environmental unconscious, a phrase that does not invoke the cultural and linguistic freightage of the world nature," unquote. All my observations when working with the Gangetic dolphins, a work I recently did for the Lahore Biennial, even as I sighted this glorious animal with its wet, shiny, bluish, grey skin, I could not help wondering how it experienced the river from below and above. In the midst of the crisis we are currently facing, the reawakening and deepening of a collective consciousness represents a vital step towards regenerating both ourselves and the worlds we inhabit. This necessitates a decentering of the human perspective, recognizing our place within a network of coexisting worlds with which we have co-evolved. The challenge may not lie in acquiring additional knowledge, but rather in adopting a position of greater humility. This encompassing of the more than human extends bidirectionally, inviting us to blur established boundaries and to expand the notion of the self. The traditional representation of the tree of life becomes a contested structural imaginary. Instead, it resembles a dynamic soup, a cauldron of biota, where life and its myriad forms emerge, thrive, and ultimately perish, only to be reformed anew. Within this interplay, genes and energy flow freely between entities, underscoring the profound interconnectedness of existence. One way it's been nicely articulated is by this philosopher, young philosopher, Bayo Akomolafe. So it's a quote I've taken from his writings. It's called, "When you meet the monster, anoint his feet." I quote, "Perhaps most important about this time is the image of the human is being composted. We are experiencing great difficulty determining where the non-human stops and the human being begins. Everything touches everything else in the Anthropocene. We live and are lived through. We are composite beings, a companion species emerging within and among assemblages. For me, I question myself always, what then is the role of art in this context? Artists have engaged with both realms, works that address climate change awareness and environmental degradation, alongside their connections to capital and material flows, illuminate the limitations of these approaches and their violent repercussions. However, artists who adopt more fundamentally critical methodologies, often embedded in the questions themselves, challenge disciplinary structures and interrogate the very nature of knowledge itself. They draw attention to peripheral issues concerning justice, diversity, multiple identities, and the more than human agencies. Furthermore, they call into question pedagogical frameworks that create binaries such as theory, practice, human more than human, and nature culture. In such a context, art finds its distinct realm. Here, the artist enacts and contributes to the shaping of new understandings, fostering alternate discourses, and initiating fresh conversations and dialogues. Art becomes a medium for new affective expressions of ecology. And I'll just spend the next 2-3 minutes showing some. This is a show I curated. It started with a conference in 2017, and then went into a art art show. It was a conference called State of Nature invited by the Girls Institute in Mumbai. It was two-day interdisciplinary conference, and all of it is online, so all the talks are online, and they're quite fascinating, I think. This was a culmination of that whole project into a show, and now there's a book being published in 2022 with my dear friend and curator of literature, Ranjit Hoskote, and we decided to collaborate because I was invited as an artistic curator, but I feel we speak too much in silos when we think of art, and we need to think across. So who better than Ranjit to talk about literature and poetry, and now you can see the list of artists there. And Ranjit curated this fantastic series of dialogues, which unfortunately most of them are online, and they're still online because of COVID. Some we did in person. And you can see from the kind of people whom he invited, and this you can find online actually, it's in the Goethe Institute website, of the fantastic conversation between philosophers, poets, writers, and you can see some of the names there, Michael Marder, Ruth Pardell, and many others. And it really opens up this whole interdisciplinarity when you think of a term called ecology, which cannot be seen only through one lens, because it's a foundational question of our times. It also then culminated into this exhibition in February 2022. Here you see our Goethe Institute collaborator, what's her name? Amrita Nevivan. I'm sorry, it slipped my mind. But that's Amrita, without which the show wouldn't have happened, because it was on the brink of the end of the COVID session, so we hardly had to be there. But these are just some images from that. I don't want to go too much in depth about it. On the left is a sculpture from Arun Kumar. In the center is a food installation of ceramics by Rajshri Goody. Then there is, I think Arun Kumar might be here in the room. There's the installation which Arun Kumar did. And there's an installation by Karan Shrestha, then Ranbir Kaleka's film on the Sundarbans, and that's also from Karan Shrestha's work. Then we also use the Natural History Museum as part of a site where Sonia Mehra Chawla showed her work, and in the middle is Parag Tandal, and on the right is Gigi Scaria. And there's Roni Deveshar, Prabhakar Panchkute, and a bit more of Parag Tandel. So the idea was to put different positions of artists who work in different ways. Some of them, like Parag, is from a fishing Kohli community, or Sonia has been following the idea of the laboratory and the politics of these biological gardens for a long time. So they have embedded long-term practices, and I was very keen to get these positions. Himali Singh Shoin also showed her work on the Nanda Devi here. And how do this converse itself? So it was not about saying this is it, it's saying what are the positions which are possible in this. Paribartana Mohanty had this work on his residency in Fukushima, which is a fantastic little thing which is not shown before. The second one is another experimental curation with Janvi Palke, who's director of the Science Gallery, historian of science, and I've invited to do in the Serendipity Arts Festival. And we invited a scientist. It's called Blue Carbon, Vardhan Patankar, and two artists, Goa artist Kaldi Moss, who was now no longer Goa artist. I think she's still here in the room somewhere. And the sound artist, and Valen James D'Souza, who's a designer and interdisciplinary artist, to think of what it means to have a science and art collaboration. And I'm very interested in this transdisciplinarity and what art can do with it. So I stop here. Thank you.